Henry Thoreau's Walden is read today and in past centuries because it offers a spiritual literature. For many readers, this is especially true in the author's portrayal of nature as something divine or as something created. In chapters 1 through 3, our author advocates for faith, the importance of faith in human life, and also particularly the study of sacred scripture. Let's talk about faith in Walden and also my proposal that our author offers compatibilism between faith and reason. First, the advocacy of faith. In chapter 1 of Walden, Henry Thoreau mentions that our preoccupation with our living, with acquiring the necessaries and the luxuries, functions contrary to faith. And our author mentions that many of his neighbors belong to churches and were raised in churches and know the words of the Bible, and yet they don't truly have the belief that is needed to live a religious life. So, for example, a quote Henry Thoreau says, "It's as if my neighbors are determined not to live by faith." Why? Because they're working too hard and their preoccupation with their homes and other possessions is taking up all of their investment. Henry Thoreau tells us that he's learned by his experience and also by faith that it is possible to make a living, day-to-day living on earth without much trouble. So in short, he thinks that the Bible has informed him that it's good to simplify your living. Chapter 3 provides the most direct advocacy of faith in Walden. There, our author proposes we ought to be spending time in serious reading. Serious reading is something we're not getting to because of our preoccupation with our living. For Henry Thoreau, serious reading means careful, thoughtful study of great books and also sacred scripture. And uniquely, our author thinks that there are many sacred scriptures of different nations and peoples that a person might study. Well, faith is just that habit of believing that truth comes from sacred scripture being authored by God. Henry Thoreau appears to champion compatibilism in Walden. Here's the evidence. Well, let's first remember the definition of compatibilism. It is the view that faith and reason are distinct areas of truth or are concerned with distinct areas of truth, but that one may support the other. St. Thomas Aquinas points out that reason, in particular science, may support faith. Henry Thoreau shows another, or the opposite side of that relationship, that faith may support reason. And this is evident in chapter 1. Henry Thoreau, as a writer, refers to well-known articles of faith in support of his reasoning and argumentation for simplifying one's living. So I'll show you two examples. There are several examples in Walden, and I think these are generally expressions of the author's thought and sort of habitual faith. So for example, this is on page 21 of chapter 1. Perhaps we should never procure a new suit, however ragged or dirty the old, until we have so conducted, so enterprised or sailed in some way, that we feel like new men in the old, and that to retain it would be like keeping new wine in old bottles. There's a well-known parable from the Christian Bible about keeping new wine in old wineskins. So Henry Thoreau paraphrases a well-known article of faith. Also, on page 69, Henry Thoreau, in talking about doing good, he writes, "If you should ever be betrayed into any of these philanthropies, do not let your left hand know what your right hand does, for it is not worth knowing." That's a well-known article of faith from the Christian Bible. And there are many examples of such references in Henry Thoreau. So articles of faith are brought to support reasoning about our living and how we might improve our lives. Another example or evidence of compatibilism is the topic of nature study. Nature study, our author mentions, has many different sub-activities. The top of the activities, or the majority of the activities, are scientific activities, activities of observing and watching, recording, and listening. At the same time, nature study at times can be miraculous. It can involve things that are wondrous and not immediately understandable by science. For example, the aurora borealis, in the 1850s was probably very strong because there were powerful solar flares, we know, according to science. Well, in Henry Thoreau's time, that would have been taken as something wonderful, as a subject of contemplating. Similarly, Henry Thoreau, when he's talking about nature study, compares it to being like the receiver of messages from heaven. There are two references in Walden, chapter 1, on pages 18 and 19. Henry Thoreau compares himself to being at a counting house in the age of exploration, and he says, "I am conducting a trade with the celestial empire." So he's referring there to like a kind of commerce with heaven. And similarly, on pages 61 and 62, Henry Thoreau refers to a trade in messages from heaven. Well, faith is just that habit of looking for truth from God, looking for truth in sacred scripture. So in practicing nature study, Henry Thoreau is pursuing the habit of faith, and he's also pursuing scientific activities and contemplatory activities all together. So for Henry Thoreau, these activities support one another and contribute to, for him, a lifelong activity. I would also like to mention that there are at least two other important theological concepts in Walden, one of which we've talked about, the concept of a genius, which is like an inner and true self. And according to Henry Thoreau, my genius, above all, notifies me or guides me to my calling, that activity which will fulfill my life. And that's very close to the idea of infusion in St. Thomas Aquinas, that God puts habits in us that enable us and empower us. I don't think that Henry Thoreau's idea of a genius is identical with the idea of infused habits, but it's a similar idea that there's guidance within us. And that idea of genius was very common in the 19th century. Also, there's the important theme of despair on the one hand and hope on the other in Walden. And despair, of course, is Henry Thoreau's diagnosis of the times, that people are working hard to fulfill their lives, and in various ways people are trapped and feeling resigned and giving up on life. And we should keep in mind that America at that time is headed towards a civil war, and plantation slavery is a very serious controversy. And we should keep in mind that there are many epidemics moving around the world. Henry Thoreau himself passed away because of tuberculosis. His older brother died. Many families lost members to airborne tuberculosis. So there were reasons for despair, and Henry Thoreau tells us that he is offering hope, that he intends to give a message of hope, which is the theological virtue. I want to read to you a famous quote, one of the most commonly quoted sentences in Walden on page 75 in chapter 2. Henry Thoreau writing, "As I have said, I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustily as Chanticleer in the morning, standing on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors up." In short, Walden intends to be a story of hope, even though there are many controversies and harms that are taking place in our lives.